Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, I think I heard some. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Kayla. And I want to give a shout out to our interns this morning, Kayla and Emily. You may not, well, yeah. If you're at either service this coming Sunday, you'll hear them singing. Kayla will be playing her violin. She accompanies our morning service at the lakefront. Kayla and Emily do the bulletins. They work at the underground till 11 o'clock several nights a week with the youth, and also with the God Squad. That's just part of what they do. So I want both to stand and let's give them another hand. And Emily's filming the What's Up Lakeside that you'll see on Friday nights in Hoover if you get there early. Well, good morning and welcome to our Wednesday morning here at Lakeside as we talk about Faith for Living today. I want to remind you a couple things. First of all, make sure your cell phones are in the off position or vibrate because we are recording these sessions. This evening is our picnic, 5:30 at Perry Park, weather permitting, with hot dogs on the grill and macaroni salad. And you've heard me do this before, and baked beans. And I guess it's a little too early to get you excited about baked beans and watermelon this time of the morning, but it'll be there tonight, and it'll be great. This afternoon, we have our Christian biography series with Dan Moulton. This afternoon, the story of William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English. And this is at 3 o'clock at the train station, and all are welcome. The seminar was very well received on Monday with Jerome. And then next week is the Art of Poem Making with John Fox, who is here, and he's going to share a moment with us.
Good morning. So next week it's called Exploring Epiphany through the poetry and poem making. And if you haven't had any experience with poetry, I still encourage you to come because it'll be safe. And also, if you love poetry, you don't want to miss this. So here's an Epiphany poem by the poet Mary Oliver. And we'll use poets as our inspiration for our own writing. This poem is called At Blackwater Pond. At Blackwater Pond, the tossed waters have settled after a night of rain. I dip my cupped hands, I drink a long time. It tastes like stone, reed, fire. It falls cold into my body, waking the bones. I hear them, deep inside me whispering, oh, what is that beautiful sound that just happened? What is that beautiful thing that just happened?
Thank you, John. This morning, I'm happy to introduce Joy Carol Wallace, who is one of the first women to be ordained in the priesthood in the Church of England. Her ministry in London's inner city embraced the needs of the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, the families, youth, and the elderly, and inspired the BBC show, The Vicar of Dibley. She will tell that story this morning. I want to share with you that Joy has written a book, which is The Woman Behind the Collar. There are a few copies left at the fine print. She has a couple with her, and she will be happy to sign these. And also, I would remind you that while Jim's book has been sold out, you can do what we've done before, take a piece of paper and ask Jim to sign it, and then you can paste it into the front of your book, and it will seem like he signed your book. We've underestimated the number of books we've needed all summer, which is kind of a good thing because we found that the speakers are more popular than we anticipated. So this is wonderful. Now, I do want to say one more thing, and that is that Joy's talk is being recorded, and there's a recording form in the back table, and you can fill that out and take it to the office, and for $10, you'll get an MP3 file of her talk. And if you buy her talk, we're going to throw in the 3 talks by Jim and the Sunday morning as well. Without further ado, would you welcome Joy Wallace?
Well, first of all, thank you, Charlie and Bob, for your hospitality and welcome and taking care of us this week. One of the lovely things about being married to Jim is I get to come along to the more interesting of his engagements and have the opportunity to share some of my story as well. So thank you, and I love Lakeside Chautauqua. It's like being welcomed into somebody else's family reunion. So, on my desk at home in Washington, D.C., sits an invitation from the Archbishop of Canterbury to go to Lambeth Palace in October to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ordination of women to the priesthood in England, and then to a service in the evening at St. Paul's Cathedral. So I'm really, really excited to be one of the first women to be ordained in the Church of England. I was in that 1994 cohort of women who were ordained for the first time. And I wanted to share a little bit of that story with you and a little bit of the history of how that came about, because people are often surprised that it took so long in England. In America, the first women were ordained in the 70s, in 1976. The Church of England is always the last bastion to fall, and it took a lot longer. In the Church of England, rather like the Catholic Church, there are three orders, holy orders. There's the bishops, the clergy, and the laity. Bishops, priests, deacons are the holy orders of the clergy. And up until 1987, women were not even allowed to be in the House of Clergy. They weren't allowed to be deacons. Women were deaconesses. They were in the House of Laity, not considered clergy. Before we were called deaconesses, we were called lady workers. And I grew up in a vicarage. My dad was a priest in the Church of England, and I remember him having a lady worker on his staff, and we called her Auntie Margaret. And I think my dad was a bit of a pioneer having a lady worker on his staff. Anyway, these women, who then became deaconesses, were doing very much of the same work as the men, deacons in these parishes, but were not recognized for it. So when I experienced the calling to go into ministry, I was an elementary school teacher, and I went to seminary believing that I would come out of seminary being a deaconess in that lay order. And while I was at seminary, the church synod decided that women were allowed to be deacons, that they could be ordained as deacons. And so when I came out in 1988, I was ordained alongside my male colleagues who I'd done the same training with as a deacon. And that was a tipping point in the movement for the ordination of women, because that meant women were allowed to wear the clerical collar, they were allowed to be called reverend, because all of a sudden, having moved from deaconess as a layperson to deacon, which was clergy, we appeared different. We appeared to look like clergy. We were addressed as clergy, we wore the collar, the women did, as deacons, weddings, baptisms, funerals, led worship on a Sunday morning, visited people in hospital, was seen about the community. And the public started saying, hold on a minute, if you're not a priest, What are you? What's the difference between, you look like a priest, you do the same things as the priest, what's the difference? And the answer to that question was interesting. It's just 3 small things. And they all happen on a Sunday morning. The priest is the only one who can say the prayer of thanksgiving over the bread and the wine. The priest, and not a deacon, can say the blessing over the congregation. And the priest can declare the forgiveness of sins after the confession. That's it. And so people began to say, well, that doesn't seem fair. That doesn't seem right, that women can't do that. And when I was ordained as a deacon, my first parish was in an inner city housing project that no men were willing to go to because it was so rough and dangerous. They called it Crack City because there was a flourishing drugs trade and crack factories in the apartments on the estate. And so on Sunday mornings, I had to get a priest from across the road off of the estate to come in to my service on a Sunday morning to do the magic bits. And so that was the reason that was the tipping point, was that people began to see visually the injustice of that. They could see that we were clergy, but not allowed to do those extra magic bits. And so began a very intense 6 years where I became a spokesperson for my diocese for the ordination of women. Because it was between that time in 1988, when I was ordained as a deacon, my colleagues went on to be, my male colleagues went on to be priests automatically a year later, and we women stayed as deacons. And it was in 1992 that the General Synod voted for women to be priests. And I was really fortunate because I had this role of being a spokesperson for the ordination of women in the diocese, and the clergy and laity in the diocese had got to know me because I'd done all these roadshows around the diocese. And so I was elected to the General Synod of the Church of England. And I ended up being the youngest member of the House of Clergy at the age of 29 on the General Synod of the Church of England. And so I was really, really fortunate to be a part of that history and to cast my vote on that historic day in 1992. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to transport you back with me to that day in the General Synod when the vote happened, because it wasn't inevitable that it was going to happen. And you'll hear why. If you let me read you the prologue of the book that Charles mentioned. It's an old book, by the way. I wrote this when my son Luke was 2 years old. And I had already moved to America after marrying Jim, when I finally had some space in my life to actually write. And so it's you know, he's 25 now, so it's an old book, but it's his story, her story. So, I ask that you greet the results, whatever they might be, with a dignified silence. Tension filled the debating chamber of Church House in Westminster. George Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was about to put an end to the agonizing wait. I had not moved all day from my seat. My body cried out for food, coffee, and painkillers for my pounding headache. But I wanted to hear every word spoken for and against the motion to ordain women to the priesthood of the Church of England. At the end of the debate, we voted. I rose to my feet and moved toward a large oak door engraved with the words, "Clergy Eyes." On either side of the door stood tellers, carefully counting each body that passed through. My hands were sweating and my heart was beating wildly. This was the precious vote I had been elected to cast. Just as I reached the door, I had a fleeting moment of panic and checked that I was going through the right door. This was not the time to make that kind of mistake. The three houses, bishops, clergy, and laity, each had to score a 2/3 majority for the motion to pass. And we knew it would be close. On the other side of the doors, in the circular corridor surrounding the chamber, those who had voted spoke in hushed tones to one another. I stood beside one of my women colleagues, a good friend from the Manchester diocese. She whispered to me with a look of agony on her face, "It feels like we've been pregnant all this time, preparing for a new birth, and now at the last minute we're not sure whether the baby will be born alive or dead." As I moved around the corridor, I passed those who had come through the clergy nose door. It was then that I saw Father Andrew, my great friend on synod, who was against the ordination of women. We had vowed to respect each other's position and to remain friends throughout. We looked at each other in this clear moment of difference. We'd come through different doors, and we hugged. Though we didn't yet know the outcome of our votes, we were both aware of the pain that one of us would soon feel. After what felt like hours, we were summoned back into the chamber, into the sure the numbers were so close in the House of Laity. My stomach clutched as the Archbishop spoke the words, "The motion is passed." We had, in fact, achieved that 2/3 majority in the House of Laity by one vote. If one layperson had voted the other way, the whole process would have been set aside until a new synod was elected. There would have been no women priests in England for another 5 to 10 years. It was amazingly close, and we were all very excited. One of my colleagues once put it, we were common law priests, and now on November 11th, 1992, the church had decided to make honest women of us. So there we were, and after the ordination of the motion to ordain women had passed, we were all very excited and thrilled and ready to start that journey towards priesthood. And yet there were many people who were very upset about this. There were clergymen who believed that the apostolic line of succession had been broken. And those who believed in tradition believed that the laying on of hands that started in the early church with the apostles, that was handed on through ordination, generation to generation to generation, from man to man to man to man, had been broken. And so the Church of England, somebody proposed a motion, and the Act of Synod was a motion that said all those clergy who can't live with this, so we're going to get a little boost, additional sound. Excellent. Okay. So all those clergy who were opposed to the ordination of women, this motion gave them a package, a financial package, to leave the church and go and start a new career. Right? Or they had three options. Their churches could sign a document that said, my church will not entertain the appointment of a woman priest. And they would be the churches who would not have women priests. Or, and this was the kicker, they were given their own bishops. 2 bishops that did not have a diocese, one for the north of England and one for the south of England. We called them flying bishops because they would fly around the country as needed to do the ordinations of men who didn't want to be ordained by a man or a bishop who had laid his hands on a woman. And the church and the synod was seriously entertaining this package of flying bishops, and in order to maintain unity in the church. And my colleagues, the women, I was the youngest. You have to remember, I was the youngest. I was 29 years old. Most of the women were much older than me. And they said, you know, Joy, we've got what we wanted. You know, let's let them have their bishops. Let's be gracious. And I'm all about being gracious and reconciliation and unity. But to me, this was theologically wrong. It really broke into the integrity of theology. And so I made a speech. It was one of the few times I spoke in the synod, but I spoke very passionately against the act of synod. And I said, it was a long speech, I won't do the whole thing, but basically my point was, if this was about offering packages of compensation and flying bishops for people who were opposed to the ordination of black people, would the synod be as gracious about it? This is a justice issue as far as I was concerned. And yet, I don't want to get too much into it now, but that motion passed. And we had flying bishops and compensation packages and churches who wouldn't ordain women. And in retrospect, people felt that was a big mistake. Anyway, that's the historic bit about the ordination of women. 10 years later or so, they allowed women to be bishops. That didn't come all at the same time either. But it's happened now. So anyway, this is the fun bit. I did promise you that this session would be a little lighter. It hasn't been so far. But what happened next was kind of fun. While I was making my speech about the Act of Synod, in the public gallery in Westminster, there was a guy who was a writer. His name was Richard Curtis. Now, Richard Curtis wrote 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Love Actually, Notting Hill, you know, all the big British comedies. He's Mr. Comedy in Britain. He created Comic Relief. He did Blackadder. Any of those of you who know and love British comedy, Richard Curtis is probably behind it. And he had this idea. He was very much in favor of women priests. He knew that the motion had passed. And he had this idea about a comedy series where a woman priest shows up in a country village where they're expecting a man called Jerry, and Geraldine shows up with her guitar. And he wrote the first episode, and he realized that he didn't know anything about women priests and the issues that they dealt with in ministry, and that he needed to talk to a real woman priest. And so he came to the public gallery and heard me speaking, and he thought, oh, she's about the right kind of age and, you know, has the same kind of interest in pop music and whatever as me, and I'm going to talk to her. He'd already chosen Dawn French to be his actress for the show, and we were very similar in many ways, same age, same haircut. And so he called me afterwards and asked me if I would be willing to talk to him about developing his ideas for the show. Eventually, when I realized who he was, I said yes. And he came to my house with Dawn French, and I was a bit nervous because she's a very famous actress in England. And I thought, oh gosh, Dawn French is coming to my house. But she put me at ease immediately because I opened the door and she stood there with a big box of chocolate eclairs and said, we can't work without chocolate. And in she came, and we spent quite a lot of time together talking about what it was like to be a woman priest and what the issues were in ministry as a woman. And we became friends, and Dawn shadowed me in my work. It was interesting because they didn't. Richard asked me things like, "What is your sermon that you preach over and over again? What's your message? You know, what's the thing you go back to all the time?" And of course, my message was, you know, I'm not particularly interested in religiosity. I'm more interested in faith being put into practice and people experiencing the love of God at all levels, personally, in the community, and in society. And I certainly believe that our faith should influence our politics and so on. And so he picked up on that. And so the first 6 episodes, I love the first 6 episodes because I kind of had a direct influence on them. And he developed these wonderful themes. One, for example, you know, the parish is saving money. They're collecting money to put a new stained glass window in the church. And one day she's watching about a famine in Africa on TV. And she's so convicted about the needs of the famine folk in Africa that she gives all the money away that has been collected for the stained glass window to the famine in Africa. And at the end of the episode, when it's the unveiling of the stained glass window, the curtain's drawn back and it's just a clear glass window, but it's looking out on the beautiful countryside with the sheep and in the fields. Another one is where the councilman, who's a very conservative Tory in England, we call them Tory councillor, comes to her very angry and says, "What was that Marxist claptrap you were preaching from the pulpit on Sunday?" And she says, "I think you'll find it's the Sermon on the Mount." And this was all before I met Jim, I'll have you know. So another episode was the blessing of the animals. The animals all come to be blessed in the church, and it's quite riotous. And I was actually there for the filming of that day, and I was standing behind Dawn, Geraldine, as she was shaking the hands of everybody coming through the gate of the church with their animals. And one guy shows up, and he's wearing a leather jacket, studded, you know, tattoos and nose ring, and he's got this really mean-looking bulldog with a studded dog collar, and and she says, "Hello, what's your name then?" to the dog, and the owner says, "Satan." And she says, "Oh, very good of you to come at all, really." So another funny story about that was when she was shadowing me, she came to watch me do a funeral one day. she showed up at my house, and as a clergy person in England, you do a lot of funerals because it's the state church. So anybody who dies in your geographical patch, whether they go to your church or not, you're the one that gets called to do the service at the creme. And so I had a fairly routine funeral to do. Somebody who had died in old age. I mean, none of them are routine, I know, but you know what I mean. And but she showed up to watch me do this funeral, and in her big, in her flashy sports car. And I said, we can't go to the creme in that. You have to get in my car and come with me. So she came, and she completely understood, and she wore a big floppy hat and sunglasses, and she disguised herself as the page turner for the organist at the back of the chapel. And so nobody in the family had any idea that Dawn French was sitting at the back of the service in the funeral. She very graciously wrote the foreword to my book. There's 2 forewords in this book. My first book, the book in England, was called The Woman Behind the Cassock. And it was a reference to a line in one of the shows where they do a Songs of Praise TV episode in her church, and she becomes infatuated with the director or the producer of Songs of Praise. And he's talking to her, and he says, "We just want to get a glimpse of the woman beneath the cassock." And she goes into the kitchen, and she's like, "Oh!" So it was called The Woman Beneath the Cassock. And then my American publishers thought that Americans wouldn't know what a cassock was. And so they called it The Woman Behind the Collar. And they also didn't really see the significance of the Vicar of Dibley. And so they didn't even mention that it was the real story of the Vicar of Dibley on the cover, which they did in the English version. So anyway, Crossroads didn't quite get it when they published this book. But there we are. So let me see. That escapade into working with Dawn and the cast of the Vicar of Dibley was a really nice kind of diversion, not a diversion, but it was a wonderful way to engage and intersect ministry with the popular culture. And the Vicar of Dibley became the show that really did kind of introduce the humanity of women priests to the general public. And people would say things like, if I went to I don't go to church, but if I had a vicar like that, I would. And she wasn't her character wasn't a character that we were supposed to laugh at. We were supposed to sympathize with her because she was surrounded by all these kind of dodgy, crazy people on the church vestry. So I was in ministry. I'm going to leave that there for now. You can ask me some more questions about the Vicar of Dibley if you want to in the question time. But I want to tell you a little bit about my ministry in the church. I started off in New Cross in the inner city. Both of my churches were urban priority areas of the Southwark Diocese in South London. In New Cross, which was my first parish, I was very young. As I say, I went there to a place where none of the men wanted to go because it was a difficult place to go. I'm going to tell you about the first experience I had there. We all make mistakes, right? When I got there, the local newspaper wrote an article about me on the estate. The Reverend Joy, the new guardian for a southeast London housing estate. And she was a kindly middle-aged woman who did a really good job of introducing me. She was a journalist, and she wrote a lovely local newspaper piece about me coming to the parish. The next day, however, a writer from the Daily Express showed up on my doorstep. Now, the Daily Express was a tabloid, one of the tabloids in England, and he kind of tricked me into talking to him. He wanted to talk to me about the drugs on the estate, and I said, look, I don't know anything about the drugs on the estate, but I'm happy to tell you about the good things that we're doing in this church, about the nursery we have for at-risk children, the homework club, the church we do on Sundays, and so on. And the next day, on January the 19th, the article appeared in the Daily Express, and I was mortified. It said, Crusader of Crack City. Curate Joy fights to make estate safe as danger drug threatens children, read the headlines on page 5. Crusading Joy Carroll stands in the front line against an evil drug epidemic which police fear is about to swamp Britain. And it went on. And it had statements, false statements, where it said that I said, I've got to protect the kids from drugs. This place must not be turned into a hellhole. They made it sound as if it was just little me standing between the drug peddlers and the police. And so I was very upset about that, and I was very afraid that I was going to get a brick through my window saying, it's time you left. I was in a very vulnerable position. Now, fortunately, I had a minister who had been working on the estate for a long time, who knew a lot of the characters, and he took me. He said, don't worry, Joy, I'm going to introduce you to somebody who you need to meet. And he took me to the pub on the estate. Now, this is not the English pub you might think of in your minds as a nice, family pub. This had no windows, and no people went in there unless you wanted to do a drug deal. And so I went with Barry, my co-minister, into the pub, and he introduced me to this group of guys sitting in the corner in the dark with their chains around their necks. And he introduced me, and I said, hi, I'm the new minister on the estate, and I'm in a bit of a sticky situation. And I explained to them what had happened. And I said, oh, by the way, I baptized your cousin's baby last week. I remember seeing you. And we got on really well. I had a pint with them. And at the end of that meeting, this guy stood up and he put his arms around my shoulder and he said, don't you worry, darling. He said, if you get into any trouble, you tell him you know Headley. And he was the big man about town. And so I was so relieved. And I walked out of there going, Headley. I am never going to remember that name. I'm never going to forget that name, because as long as I have Headley and Jesus on my side, I'm good. So those years were very interesting. I was there for 5 years, and then I moved on to another parish in South London. And another story of ministry. Once a month, I would do a special service at the nursing home across the street from the church. And most of these residents who lived there were suffered with Alzheimer's. And very much like the home my dad just was in before he died. And I did this service with them. I took a group of people from the church. Our organist came and played the piano. And I would go and dress up I would wear my robes, my clerical robes, and we would do a short, abbreviated communion service. We'd say the Lord's Prayer, and we would sing some very familiar hymns. and folks would sit around and join in as they were able, and some not really very responsive. But it always amazed me how, even though, a person couldn't remember that their daughter had just visited them, would remember the words to the hymns from deep down, from long, long ago, would automatically be able to say the familiar prayers in the liturgy and the Lord's Prayer. And so it was a real moment of helping and being with people as they connected to that part of themselves that belonged to God all those years. And a very special time. And I remember I used to go round to give them the bread, a wafer, and wine. And I would go round to each person and say, the body and blood of Christ. And I would have to say, open your mouth. And so I would say, the body and blood of Christ, open your mouth, and then it would go. And there was one guy who couldn't quite get the idea that I was a woman, because this was all so new then. And some people thought I was the Virgin Mary. Some people thought I was Princess Diana. Nobody was quite sure who I was. And this guy every time I would say, the body and blood of Christ, open your mouth. And he would say, no, I'm Church of England. And I would say, I am Church of England, open your mouth. And he would open his mouth. And so that was, I loved going there. So 25 years ago, I was involved in a festival, a music and arts festival in England called Greenbelt. And I met my husband there. He was one of our American speakers, and we were on a panel together. We were speaking on a topic, what's the point of being an evangelical? This was 25 years ago, 26, 27, no, this was longer than that, because 28 years ago, it was 1994, whenever, it was 30 years ago. And that was the first time I met Jim. And we disagreed on that panel, and we still do, as he mentioned the other day. So I won't go into that. But after a 2-year transatlantic courtship, I married Jim, and everything changed for me. How much time have I got? Okay. Everything changed for me, and I kind of reinvented myself in many ways. For a short time, I was the associate rector at Grace Church in Georgetown and the minister at helping to lead the Sojourners worship. And then I had 2 sons, 5 years apart, who are now grown up, and I became a baseball mum. I didn't go back into the church. I based myself at home and in the community. And I became that mum who runs all the school auctions. I was the baseball Little League commissioner. I did all kinds of things in the community. I organize an annual trip for the high school baseball players to the Dominican Republic, where we do service and raise lots of money to take with us, turning that into a non-profit right now. I run a festival in America based on the Greenbelt Festival where we met, called the Wild Goose Festival. And the Wild Goose Festival is a music, arts, and justice festival in North Carolina that's held every summer. We just were there a couple of weeks ago. So I was a founding board member of that because we wanted to create an American version of Greenbelt. So look at that. You'd love it. wildgoosefestival.org. If you want a break from cool Lakeside and go into the heat of North Carolina. So anyway, I do lots of different things. I have another whole talk that's about the changing faces of vocation and how I also am a substitute teacher at the school that my kids went to, and I really do feel like sometimes I think people might think I've kind of gone backwards, But I actually feel like I've come full circle, and I brought the priest in me, with me, to everything I do. And I challenge folks to say, we need to find what it is for us to do. And it doesn't need to be wearing a collar or inside the walls of the church. It can be ministry wherever we find ourselves. And I feel very fulfilled in doing all those things that I do in my new world. So anyway, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for listening to my stories. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer. Any questions? Yes.
Issues of poverty have been central to Jim's work, and it sounds like it was central to your work also. And I'm just wondering, as I think about the potential differences in poverty, if there is differences in poverty